So chapter 18 of When the Night Comes Falling, this is enormous again. Now, I want to say, I understand Howard Blum is not the definitive answer. I understand who can trust Howard Blum. I understand, oh my God, why are you reading his book? I told you before, this is my job. And this chapter has answered, now listen, answered some questions I've had for a long time. Why was Jack DuCoer ruled out? What was Jack DuCoer's alibi? Because I've asked before, like, they said that he's been ruled out. What is his alibi? Will we ever know? Now, an answer is provided in this chapter. It's super interesting. An answer is provided by Blum. Also, the million-dollar question. Why does Steve Goncalve act the way that he does? Why is he going on every talk show, every opportunity to get on camera like he does? Why has his opinions seemed to change? Guess what? This chapter has an answer. Now again, you can say Howard Blum is not trustworthy. Fine. But I have not had answers for these things, and at least this is an answer. It may not be the answer you like. It may not be the answer you believe in. You may just completely ignore it and not want to hear it because it's Howard Blum. And I would say that you're being closed-minded if you do that. Pay attention to what's being said. There are some stunners in my mind. If you haven't heard this, I hadn't heard it until I read this chapter. It's questions I have been asking. Why was Jack DuCoer ruled out? What was Jack DuCoer's alibi? Why did Steve Goncalve not suspect Jack DuCoer? Well, he did. And that's going to be an important part of this chapter. Watch what happens. This is incredible stuff to think about. Again, whether or not you believe Howard Blum can be trusted or not, that's a whole other issue. Chapter 18. In the agonizing aftermath of his daughter Kaylee's murder, Steve, his wife, and their remaining children had been brought low. But more demonstratively than the others in the family, his anger, as displayed in his public utterances, spewed out raw and unfettered. One day he railed with an uncomprehendable anguish at the injustice of it all. You can't imagine sending your girl to a college and they come back in an urn. He grieved openly to a group of reporters. You're numb. You can't absorb that amount of pain and agony. Next, he chose to scorn the capricious, flattering manner with which he had decided law enforcement had been attempting to solve the murders. I don't feel confident, he responded with a vehement candor when asked on news shows what he thought about the police investigation. And that's why I pushed the envelope and say a little more. Yet even as he made himself available to nearly every journalist who reached out to him, Steve couldn't help feeling, he confided to a friend, that all his heartfelt proclamations, everything he had been calling truths, added up to little more than a sort of self-indulgence. His public sharing of his anguish and misgivings gave him little comfort. I hate to be that guy, he would say. Now let's stop for a minute. I have said this before, and I want to say it again. I sympathize with Steve Goncalve. I want to also point out that when we are criticizing Steve Goncalve and the way that he seems to be one way one day and change his opinion the other day can make sense from a human compassion standpoint. This is a father who has lost his daughter in a horrific way. He wants to make sense of it all. He's lashing out one day in anger, one day in sympathy, changing his feelings and emotions because he may be a wreck. So please keep this in mind when you're trying to be a little critical of Steve Goncalve. This man could be a wreck inside, most likely is a wreck inside, and doesn't know how to respond one moment from the next. So we can give the man a little grace and a little leeway. I am critical of some of the things as we've gone later into the story, how quickly or how different Steve Goncalve is today than he was then. But I feel like I understand on the inside, and I'm going to share with you the evolution of Steve Goncalve's thought process as a man. But let's point out a few things about this chapter, or this paragraph, that I want you to pay attention to. Again, Steve Goncalve was critical of law enforcement in the beginning. Steve Goncalve is, as they say, reaching out to nearly every journalist who would talk to him. And he feels like maybe he doesn't want to be that guy. But he's also pushing the envelope. He's sharing things that perhaps he shouldn't share, despite the gag order, because he's pushing the envelope. Why? Because he wants to solve his daughter's murder. And I would argue by this chapter, he wants to lead his family. He wants to be a source of strength for his family. And so he's going to go out and he's going to catch the killer. That's kind of what we're going to get from this chapter. Steve Goncalve made it his mission about, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I'm going to get to the truth. And if I have to talk to everybody and knock on everybody's effing door, I'm going to get to the truth. I can understand this at a human level. But there's details in here that are going to be, in my opinion, a bit explosive. And I'm going to break that down for you. And again, if you don't appreciate this kind of long content and you want bullet points and you want to get out, I'm not going to do that. You're going to have to wade through a little bit description. Now, listen. Hand in hand with that, Another sorrow he couldn't identify as a clear-headed strategy to lead his grieving family forward. Never had he been so unprepared, and yet had his family needed him so much. He was at a loss. And again, I understand. Steve Goncalve at times seems to be at odds with his wife on how to react. Steve's trying to do what he can to be the strong person to lead forward. And again, I can be sympathetic with that. So despite any times you've heard me being critical of Steve Goncalve, and I'm not going to stop being critical of Steve Goncalve, so pay attention. What I'm saying is, we need to have compassion for what happened to this man and understand and give him a little leeway that some of the things he's going to do at certain times aren't going to make a lot of sense because we aren't going through the same things. Now, maybe somebody out there who's listening to this has gone through something like this. And if you have, then certainly you should understand this kind of and have some kind of compassion. But let's go. For weeks, he had been struggling. No dogma, no emotions. It was as if he had been letting himself be tossed around by the surging waves of breaking news, but now finally he knew what to do. Now again, Steve Goncalve, what it's telling us is in the early stages, Steve Goncalve was just getting tossed around by this news and that. He was just going with the flow. Again, can explain why behavior has changed from the early. A lot of us are asking questions. Why, Steve, when the early days did you think this? And why did you change? How did you go from being questioning of law enforcement to being convinced Bryan Kohberger is the guy? When did that change? Well, you're getting an explanation. In the early days, he was tossed to and fro, but now he's finally come up with an idea what he's going to do. He would do it, it says, because for a father, no sacrifice is too great, and a father's duty to his child never ends, not even with her death. He would do it because he was a man alone with his family's support and assistance. They became a force whose commitment and focus was greater than anything the so-called authorities could muster. He would do it because to walk any other path would be weakness or even cowardice. He would join the hunters and would solve the case. Now, that's important. I have maintained for quite some time that I believe this mysterious leaker that people are talking about at the time that this recording is made, somebody inside law enforcement who's leaking information to mainstream media, leaking information to Dateline, and is the subject of an investigation now as Hitler wants to know who's leaking information. This sentence explains what I've been saying. I think the leaker also is in connection with Steve Goncalve. And here you see, he was going to join. He's going to join the hunters, right? So he's joining law enforcement. Again, I'm reading into this. He's going to join the hunters. So when we see that Steve starts out critical of law enforcement, he hadn't joined the hunters. But in his mind, at some point, he changed and said, I'm going to join the hunters. And some of that included his own hiring of a private investigator, I'm told. His own detective work, we're going to see. But also at some point, he decided to join the hunters, which means, in my opinion, this is my analysis, at some point, when the hunters told him, when the law enforcement told him, this is who did it or who we believe it did it, he joined forces with that and solidified and became a spokesperson for that way. That's what changed. In the early days, he was critical of law enforcement. He wanted to know what's going on. He didn't believe certain things. We're going to go over that in detail. But at some point, he changed and wanted to join the hunters. He's on law enforcement's side. He's with them. He's lock, step, and barrel is kind of how I interpret that. So let's go on about reading this. Now, this is an interesting story that he relates. It's about Kaylee Goncalve, who happened to notice something strange about a missing person from Coeur d'Alene. I told you before, Kaylee's from Coeur d'Alene, Maddie's from Coeur d'Alene, Jack DuCoeur is from Coeur d'Alene, Xana is kind of from Coeur d'Alene. All of these people came from Coeur d'Alene. People who are suspected of the crime peripherally also have connections to Coeur d'Alene. Everybody seems to be connected to Coeur d'Alene. But in this story that we're just going to highlight a few pieces of, because you can read the whole chapter if you want to in its entirety on your own when you buy the book for yourself, if you're willing to do that, is Kaylee had convinced her boyfriend at the time. Now keep in mind, this is October 5th, 2021. This is a year before the murders. She's boyfriend and girlfriend with Jack DuCoer. She broke up with him about 3 weeks prior to the murders. Again, that's important timing. But here we have, when they're boyfriend and girlfriend, about a year before the murders, Kaylee convinces her boyfriend to go to a Walmart supercenter in Pullman. She recognized some woman there. She saw some woman and she recognized this old woman's face, or older woman's face. I shouldn't say old woman. I'm probably freaking old. But the point being is she recognized an older woman's face, and she kept making like, I know that face. And so hours later, she knew she had just seen the face again, this time on a missing persons flyer. So she saw a woman in Walmart. They made eye contact. They made a connection. And then later she sees a missing persons flyer, and Katie remembers. The woman, Kaylee was convinced, was Sharon Archer, a frail 62-year-old suffering from acute diabetes and brain damage who had abruptly vanished a week earlier from the house that she shared with her husband up in North Coeur d'Alene. Everybody comes from Coeur d'Alene. Kaylee remembers seeing this woman missing from Coeur d'Alene. She sees this woman now in a Walmart in Pullman. Now, all of this stuff, by the way, isn't going somewhere you think it's going, so it's not super important, other than what I'm going to point out now. At 10:15 that night, just moments before all the pieces had clicked into place in her mind, Kaylee promptly telephoned the Moscow Police Department. She spoke to Sergeant Dustin Blaker, telling him that she was convinced she'd spotted the woman, and then for good measure, she sent an email with the missing persons notice attached. Now, the reason why I bring this out is there are a lot of rumors online about Kaylee being stalked by, or having an officer who was obsessed with Kaylee or was interested in Kaylee and that she was afraid of. Names have been dropped left and right. Rosenthal and Payne, all kinds of people. Now we got Blaker. But the point being is that it's just again, I'm not saying she did have a stalker in the police department. What I'm saying is we have multiple occurrences, verification through little things that, for example, Blum is telling us, and things that have been leaked to the media, that Kaylee had multiple connections with law enforcement. She had reached out to the police about a missing persons person that she suspected, so she reached out to the police there. She had reached out to the police when she thought she had a stalker, and the police investigated there. Kaylee had multiple times had connections with the Moscow Police Department. So just keep that in the back of your mind when you're exploring the idea that was there an officer who was obsessed with Kaylee. If you think it's just a random coincidence that some random cop on the street might be interested in Kaylee, it's not so random if you realize that Kaylee has multiple interactions with police officers. As it happened, and also, of course, the call-ins from noise complaints where officers come up and talk to Kaylee. Kaylee had a lot of interactions with Moscow police before her murder. So just, again, when you're exploring that kind of stuff, keep in mind, this is just another piece of her making contact and connections with Moscow Police Department. Now, as it happened, it wasn't Kaylee's call that solved the mystery. More than 2 anxious weeks passed before an angler perched on a dock noticed a bulky shape entombed in the lead gray depths of Fernan Lake, a popular fishing spot about 10-minute drive from downtown Coeur d'Alene. When police lifted a white Toyota Highlander from the water, a body was inside. The autopsy identified the corpse as Sharon Archer. So his daughter, Steve Goncalves' daughter, had a suspicion this woman was a missing person, called it in, and then ironically enough, not ironic, that's not the right word, coincidentally enough, I don't even know if that's the right word, a few weeks later, they find this person dead in a car, and Kaylee had seen her alive. So that's just an interesting piece. It does not, in my mind, does not relate to the Idaho 4 murders, other than, again, that Kaylee has run multiple connections to the Moscow Police Department for various reasons. Now, here's more interesting stuff. Steve Goncalves found himself recalling his daughter's attempt to solve that mystery, and it had dawned on him that just as Kaylee had unhesitantly thrown herself into the investigation, he had a responsibility too. He was caught up in a true crime story, and prodded by his daughter's example, he would act. He would play the detective. This is what drives me nuts as a true crime podcaster, researcher, whatever, is how many people will destroy me and tell me that I am a horrible human being and stay the hell out of it. This is the job for the law enforcement. You're just a true crimer and you guys are hurting families. And again, apparently Steve Goncalves can do it and you're okay with that. Apparently everybody else can investigate. His daughter can investigate true crime and that's okay. But if I do it, I'm an asshole. Okay, yes, I'm getting a little offensive. But the point being is that Steve Goncalves is doing the same thing I'm doing. Steve Goncalves has problems with the official stories and he wants to go solve a crime. And this one is his daughter's life. I'm as interested in this case, not as Steve Goncalves. Don't get me wrong. That's not what I was trying to say. What I'm saying is I'm as interested in this case as anyone, save for maybe somebody who lost a family member. So I have a huge interest in this case. And so I will play detective like Steve Goncalves. Maybe you only give permission for Steve Goncalves and law enforcement to investigate this case. But that's why I am also obsessed. And again, shaming everybody for looking into the details is a horrendous thing. That's enough of that. Sweeping all the extraneous emotional debris cluttering his mind aside, he decided to live by his wits. He went on the hunt. Working with Olivia, his oldest daughter, Steve began checking out Kaylee's phone for clues. By the way, I want to stop there. Olivia was the one who actually pointed the police in the right direction to many things, including the fact that Kaylee had called some kind of ride share to get home that night, that Kaylee was at the grub truck. That kind of shit hadn't even been picked up by law enforcement yet. It was Olivia, allegedly, Steve Goncalve's daughter, that went and found that information and looked through Kaylee's phone and said to the police, hey, she was at the grub truck at such and such time in the morning before the murders. Why does that have to be something that the family has to find out? Why can't law enforcement have already been on that right off the bat? That's one of the million-dollar questions I have as well. Because we know that Olivia did a lot of early investigation into the murders that the police weren't even doing, and that she tipped the police off onto where places to go look. The two of them went through, and this is the two of them meaning Steve and Olivia, the daughter, went through the list of contacts in Kaylee's phones, reached out to Kaylee's friends, and helped to reconstruct the last hours of his daughter's and best friend's Maddie's last hours, and shared them with authorities. So again, Steve Goncalve and his daughter are doing research work that the police should be doing. Now, to be fair to the police department, maybe they had other things they were doing at the moment, and this family obviously is going to be obsessed about their daughter, their sister, and on it a little ahead of them. So one could maybe excuse that police weren't just doing nothing, but the point being is it's just, I've always found it odd that it has to be Olivia and Steve Goncalve now, what we're hearing, that's doing the research and telling police where their daughter was in the minutes before. Well, anyways. They also discovered the persistent series of calls in the wee hours of the morning from Kaylee to her ex-boyfriend, Jack DuCoer. So again, this, by the way, is some relatively new information about the whole phone calls and how many times that Kaylee had called Jack DuCoer, not moments, but very shortly before the murders, with at least literally within an hour or so of the murders. And so Kaylee, so they discover the persistent series of calls in the wee hours of the morning from Kaylee to her ex-boyfriend, Jack DuCoer, calls that had gone unanswered. Steve quickly passed that intelligence too onto the cops. Okay, so we're going to get into some crazy shit here about Jack DuCoer and his alibi, because I've always asked what his alibi was and whether or not, why did Steve never suspect Jack DuCoer? But he did. Okay, Blue, changing subject. When the Moscow PD summarily hooked Jack up to a lie detector and administered a DNA swab to compare with the evidence of the crime scene, he passed both examinations, according to one of Steve's friends. Okay, so here in part is the answer. It's an answer. Sorry, here in part is an answer. What alibi does Jack DuCoer have? Well, they did a DNA swab and it didn't match Brian Kohberger's DNA at the crime scene. Okay, now keep in mind, Jack DuCoer is a boyfriend of Kaylee. Jack DuCoer's DNA is all over that house. I'm sure he's been in that house many times. Years well, not years, because they weren't in that house for years. But the point being is that he had, I'm sure, been in the house many times. So we know Jack DuCoer's DNA is in the house. So to say that his DNA didn't match the crime scene would actually be, in my opinion, a little bit of a misnomer. His DNA is at the crime scene, I almost guarantee you. It's just that they didn't feel it significant because all they're focusing on is a piece of DNA the size of a grain of sand on a knife sheath. And all other DNA be damned. The blood stain on the banister on the downstairs floor, who cares? That's not the killer. The blood stain inside a glove outside the house on the night of the killings, who cares? That's not the killer. We're only going to focus on one piece of DNA. All other DNA in the house be damned. So because Jack DuCoer's DNA didn't match the knife sheath, they're going to rule him out. That's what it sounds like. And also they gave him a lie detector. Lie detectors aren't admissible in court for reasons. So they gave him a lie detector test and he passed the lie detector test. Believe me, and maybe that's important. Maybe that's important for a lot of you, but believe me, a lot of people can pass lie detector tests. There are ways to fool lie detector tests. Now, whether or not Jack DuCoer just flat out wasn't involved, and I don't know what questions were asked. We don't know what questions were asked of him. You know, point being, that now is an answer to how was Jack DuCoer ruled out. Well, he took a polygraph, so we know, or a lie detector test, and they did a DNA swab and he didn't match the crime scene, which again is suspicious because his DNA is at that crime scene, I guarantee you. Okay, but anyways, here's the kicker. Steve, however, was not completely assuaged. Steve Goncalve doesn't. It's not good enough for Steve. Oh, you did a DNA swab and a polygraph. I'm not happy with that. Steve was not, according to Howard Blum, Steve was not assuaged by the fact that Jack DuCoer had passed a lie detector test. He still, reading between the lines, still suspected Jack DuCoer of being involved in his daughter's murder. So when did that change? Let's read on. Nothing about the murders made any sense, and so everything seemed possible. Suspicion lay claims to his thoughts. So Jack, according to Blum, Steve Goncalve is suspicious of Jack DuCoer. Furthering, when a grieving Jack came to the Goncalves' home not long after the events to pay his respects, Steve gravely demanded the young man submit to the indignity of a physical inspection. Jack promptly rolled up his sleeves, lifted his shirt, exposed his neck, displayed his hands palms up, while Steve meticulously searched in vain for telltale scratch or bruise. Oh my God, I haven't heard this before. So Steve Goncalve absolutely was suspicious that Jack DuCoer could be involved in his daughter's death. I'm sure he knew about the breakup weeks before of their relationship. And when Jack comes over to grieve with the family, the attitude he has from the way this is written is, roll up your fucking sleeves. I want to see your arms. I want to see your palms. Roll your palms over. I'm going to look at your neck. I'm looking for signs. I want you to prove to me you didn't have anything, and you will undergo a body search. Is that the kind of man who's never suspected Jack DuCoer? No. So now we get told this story that, hey, Jack couldn't have done this. Well, there was a time when Steve Goncalve very much believed that Jack can do it. But Steve Goncalve was told Jack passed a lie detector test, which wasn't good enough for him at first, and a DNA swab, and was cleared, and it still wasn't good enough for Steve Goncalve. Now he's doing a full body search of Jack DuCoer, demanding he show his body, and he takes pictures. But Steve was not done. He caught up on his newfound forensic professionalism. He took a series of photographs documenting Jack's unblemished state. It was exculpatory evidence that would come in handy, he felt, as the authorities proceeded to compile their list of suspects. And with that bit of awkward business out of the way, the two grieving men finally embraced. So, Steve Goncalve did suspect Jack DuCoer. He did make him go under a physical examination to see if he had any scratches. And he took photos of the young man. So, and now granted, you can say he's taking photos to not establish, that's not the right word, because you're gonna misinterpret what I'm saying. He took pictures to show that Jack DuCoer had an unblemished body, is the way that Howard Blum is describing it, which would be like, hey, okay, I don't think you had anything to do with this. I'm going to take pictures documenting it. On this day you weren't showing any physical signs of being involved. But he obviously suspected it. He was looking for it, but he took pictures once he realized he didn't have wounds, because maybe later on when they come down and they say, yeah, maybe Jack DuCoer was involved with it, he'd be like, well, I did a physical inspection of his body that you didn't do, and I took pictures of it. I don't see any marks on him, so here's my detective work. That's the way I'm interpreting what Steve's doing. It's not necessarily to say Jack DuCoer couldn't have been involved, but it sounds in a little way like the police didn't go that far. The police didn't take images of I don't know. Did the police do a full body search on Jack DuCoer? Did they look for scratches? Did they take body pictures of him, of his physical condition? Or did Steve Goncalve do it because he knew the police didn't do that, and so he was going to start doing his own detective work? In the days that followed, Steve tracked down Hunter Johnson. So now he's going after another person that he doesn't believe. He doesn't believe the story, is what it sounds like. And Steve's knocking on every door and asking every question. At some point, this does change. Steve Goncalve starts to join the hunters, and which is the law enforcement, and going with their story. But at the early stages, he's not. He's suspecting everyone. And he goes into Hunter Johnson, Chapin's closest friend, Ethan Chapin, the victim in the case, his closest friend. And just before noon on November 13th, Johnson, incredibly prior to even police having been notified, had been summoned by the two distraught survivors to the King Road house. Again, let me make sure you understand what they said. Oddly enough, the girls who were in the bloodbath house that reeked so bad police immediately smelled death in the house as soon as they walked into it, instead of calling 911, who did they call first? They called Ethan Chapin. Now Steve Goncalve wants some questions answered from Ethan Chapin. Yes, I'm giving you a little bit of a spin on it to show you what I'm seeing. Now, he had discovered Ethan's body. That's Hunter Johnson had discovered Ethan Chapin's body. And now he gave his eyewitness account to Steve as a soldier might, straightforward, factual, and without embellishment or emotion. It was only after they finished that the two men, both overwhelmed, at last convulsed into tears. So again, Steve Goncalve, breaking this down, is interrogating Ethan Chapin because maybe Steve Goncalve doesn't buy the story about the 911 call. There's something suspicious. His hairs. I'm guessing. I'm telling. Unlike Blum, I'm guessing at thought processes going on in Steve Goncalve's head. Now, Blum has no problem telling you what people are thinking. I'm going to tell you. I'm guessing. Steve Goncalve is suspicious. He's suspicious of Jack. He's suspicious of the 911 call. He's suspicious of the girl's story. He's asking everybody to recount their thing. And after he's done his own investigation and he's come to his own mind, yeah, this guy looks sincere. He seems to be telling the truth. Then they embrace and they convulse into to tears. Okay, so Steve also made a point of knocking on the doors in the houses adjacent to the murder scene and interrogating neighbors. And he had posted on Facebook. Now, again, if I were to go knock on the neighbors' doors at King residence and start asking neighbors questions, you would all crucify me. Not necessarily you. Again, you who watch my channel probably aren't the person to do that. But most people, it seems like in the public, those who buy the Kohberger story would just crucify me if I was out there knocking on doors. But Steve can. And I get it. You think there's a huge difference. I get it. Between a father trying to investigate his daughter's death and me trying to investigate his daughter's death. I get it. But I would argue we're doing the same thing. It's just that you crucify me for it and it's okay for him. And he posted on Facebook asking if anybody had any information. He was going where he felt he had to go, but his mission had not produced the desired results. Weeks had passed and there had been no arrest. The authorities had not named a suspect. It was infuriating, and the prospect of his daughter's murder became one more cold case. Was torture. This is where some things I think this is an answer to when things changed for Steve Goncalve. But as much as he needed to see a perp, understand this, as much as Steve needed to see a perp being let off in handcuffs, he was also chasing after something else. He needed to know why. Why these kids? Why this house? Why this nightmare that enveloped his family's life? For his own peace of mind, he required a motive. And without his knowledge, nothing in his life from November 13th onward would ever make sense. I want to make sure you understand my interpretation of that paragraph if Howard Blum is correctly relating Steve Goncalve's thought process. And again, there's reason to believe that Howard Blum is just making shit up. But if it is, this is a man who needs to have an answer. Can that kind of person need to have resolution? And if Bryan Kohberger is what the authorities say is it, then he needs it to be true. He needs it for his own mental health. He needs it to be Bryan Kohberger. So just please hear me out. To keep in the back of your mind that there's a motivation. This man is struggling for answers and he needs resolution. He needs to be able to sleep at night. And so did he join forces with law enforcement and needed to get a resolution that he could feel like justice had been served? It was, he'd let people know, those currents of frustration and perplexity that pushed him to double down on his detective mission. He made up his mind to reach out to more people and proclaim his new ambitious vocation more directly. He would make a public appeal. Steve was certain that even if the police had failed to locate them, there had to be people out there who knew more than they were sharing. Someone, particularly a student with some dodgy antics to hide, might be more willing to whisper secrets to a mourning father than the judgmental police. Okay, so again, it's showing some distance between Steve and the law enforcement. With his plan in mind, Steve reached out to Olivia Vitale. So let's stop there. We're not getting into Olivia or who she is at this moment. I just want you to contemplate some of the big, what I find shocking explanations for behavior that we've often asked. Why is Steve Goncalve seemingly so wishy-washy? Why in the early stages of the investigation was he open to the idea that there are other people who might be involved, like Jack DuCoeur, the boyfriend, who might have had a more motive than anyone else because his daughter had dumped him and made a public spectacle of their relationship ending at a bar the night that she was murdered. There are other people who also have motives. Ethan Chapin's story doesn't seem to make sense to Steve Goncalve. The girl's story doesn't seem to make sense. But at some point, in his need to come to a resolution, Steve Goncalve started to have a different answer. Bryan Kohberger's the guy. Now, again, I'm not saying that Steve Goncalve hasn't seen something that changed his mind. But keep in mind that there's a possibility that Steve Goncalve needed to see something that would change his mind because it's necessary for him to move on. Food for thoughts for the day. Thanks for listening.